The galaxy is a graveyard lit by false suns, and within its endless night there are truths that mortals were never meant to touch. To defy the warp is to walk upon a razor's edge above an ocean of madness. Empires have fallen, primarchs have vanished, and entire worlds have been unmade because they dared to resist what should never be resisted. For the warp is not simply a storm, it is thought made flesh, desire turned predator, and memory sharpened into claws. And those who raise their hands against it, who imagine themselves immune to its reach, soon learn that every act of defiance is also an invitation. The curse is not always sudden. Sometimes it is slow, patient, whispered through generations until bloodlines themselves turn to chains. And sometimes it is merciless, immediate, like fire swallowing a man's lungs before he can scream. Yet always in every case the destiny is the same, ruin written in silence. It began quietly, as such things often do. The air over the fields of Veora tasted wrong, faintly metallic, as though a storm lingered perpetually just beyond the horizon. The people who worked the soil noticed first. They did not know the language of the warp, nor the nature of its shadows, but they felt it in their bones. Bread went stale faster, candles guttered in places with no draught. Children woke screaming from dreams they could never describe, their tiny bodies shaking as if caught in a winter frost despite the summer heat. It was nothing that could be measured, nothing that a scribe could write into a report, and yet it spread like an invisible sickness, hollowing the spirit before a single drop of blood was shed. On the third week of these disturbances, Father Halric stood before his congregation in the chapel that had outlasted 3 generations of war. His voice cracked as he raised the Emperor's name, but the hymn faltered. It was not the people who failed him, it was the silence that swallowed his words, as if sound itself recoiled from devotion. Some swore they saw the great statue of the Emperor's likeness in the nave flicker, as though a trick of the torchlight distorted its aquila into shapes it was never meant to hold. A woman fainted mid-prayer, clutching her chest as though her heart had skipped 3 beats at once. The faithful left that day unsettled, wondering if their prayers had been heard at all, or if some unseen ear had twisted them into mockery. The Astra Militarum regiment stationed nearby dismissed these reports. Men of steel and promethium, hardened by campaigns on orc-held moons and heretic-ridden wastes, they laughed at talk of whispers in the dark. Sergeant Corvale spat into the mud and told the villagers that fear was a weapon of cowards. His men patrolled with the dull arrogance of those who believed themselves immune to what they could not see. Yet even in the barracks, oddities took root. Lasguns discharged with sputters, their capacitors drained without reason. Vox units caught fragments of words in no tongue recognized by man, voices like knives scratching across the inside of the skull. And at night, soldiers dreamed of marching, endlessly marching toward a horizon that bled. There was one man, a lowly scribe named Geraint, who kept record of these events in his data slate. He was no soldier, no priest, merely a servant of ink and memory. His writings were careful, restrained, but each entry carried the weight of dread. He noted the cattle that refused to feed, the birds that abandoned their nests, the machinery in the manufactorum that seized without cause. He wrote of men who heard their own names whispered from empty corners, and of children who drew symbols in the dirt they could not possibly know. The overseers mocked him, but he continued, for he sensed that this was not madness. It was a pattern, growing tighter, each incident pulling the veil thinner. And then came the first true sign. A young guardsman, barely past training, wandered from his post. They found him at dawn, standing in the chapel, his eyes wide and unblinking, lips moving soundlessly. When shaken, he did not respond. When dragged away, he screamed in a voice not his own, guttural and layered, as though something inside him clawed to be heard. His body convulsed, bones snapping with sickening cracks, until at last he fell still, his face frozen in an expression of rapture rather than terror. They burned the remains under order of the commissar, though the fire seemed reluctant, smoldering longer than it should have, as if the flesh refused to release what it held. By then, no one laughed. The farmers locked their doors at sundown, whispering prayers that tasted bitter on their tongues. Soldiers kept their lasguns close even when they slept. though more than one woke to find the charge packs drained as if bled dry by unseen mouths. The priest lingered at his altar longer than ever, though his eyes no longer lifted to the statue above him, and Geraint wrote still, though his hand trembled with every word, for he knew he was recording not simply strange events, but the first movement of something vast, something patient, and something that had noticed them. The warp does not rush. It coils, it whispers, it teaches mortals to grow accustomed to its presence until they mistake infection for life itself. And here, on this forgotten world beneath the Emperor's stars, its first whispers had been heard. Whether anyone understood them was irrelevant. The message was already delivered. The curse had begun. The following night stretched long, each hour heavier than the last, as if time itself resisted moving forward. Those who still dared to sleep no longer spoke of dreams. They awoke pale, trembling, their eyes fixed on corners where nothing stood, their breaths quick and shallow as if their lungs had been filled with ash. Mothers clutched their children too tightly, as though their grip alone could anchor them to reality. Fathers carried blades to their own hearths, not in defense against raiders or beasts, but against something unseen, something that could crawl into the soul and hollow it out. In the heart of the garrison, discipline began to fracture. Guardsmen who had marched through storms of fire, who had faced orcs roaring with chains of teeth and blood, now whispered together in fear. One refused to remove his helmet even when off duty, insisting that if he did, something would pour into his skull and nest there. Another slit his own palm and watched the blood drip with fascination, claiming it spoke to him in patterns only he could read. The commissar executed him swiftly, but no one felt reassured. If anything, the shot rang through the barracks as a confirmation of dread. Father Halric tried to renew their courage. He opened the chapel each dawn, though fewer souls came. He lit candles, though their flames bent unnaturally, flickering sideways as though pulled toward some unseen breath. He prayed, louder now, desperate, but his words seemed to echo wrong, stretched into unnatural syllables. On the fourth morning he looked up at the statue of the Emperor and swore the stone eyes were wet as though carved from living flesh. He told no one. He merely continued to pray, because what else could he do but cling to ritual, even as ritual turned to ash in his mouth. Geraint the scribe became more restless with each passing day. His notes grew erratic, not for lack of effort, but because his data slate itself flickered. Lines of text rearranged themselves while he wrote. Names vanished, replaced by words that stung his vision, symbols his mind could not hold without pain. He tried to scratch them into parchment instead, thinking ink would resist what circuits could not, but the words bled across the page, blurring into shapes that writhed when he glanced away. Still he continued. He could not stop. Some deep part of him believed that if no record were kept, the events themselves would unravel him entirely. It was on the seventh night that the first true crack in their world appeared. A storm broke, sudden and violent, though no weather had been forecast and the skies had been clear a heartbeat before. Lightning fell without thunder, slashing the sky in jagged streaks of violet. The ground shook as though something vast moved beneath it. Windows shattered across the settlement, glass driven inward as if pressed by unseen palms. In the chaos, a farmer's child was found standing in the open square, arms raised to the lightning. Her eyes glowed faintly, and her mouth moved in a chant that none recognized but all felt in their marrow. When her father rushed to her, she turned her head slowly, far too slowly, and whispered a word that made his heart seize. He fell dead at her feet, and she collapsed seconds later, limp and empty, as if nothing had ever spoken through her at all. The commissar ordered her body taken and burned with the same grim efficiency as the guardsmen before. But no one moved at first. Soldiers who had fought orcs and stared into Necron eyes hesitated before a small, lifeless child. That hesitation was enough to spread the rot deeper, for hesitation is the first victory of fear. That night the garrison doubled their patrols, but it made no difference. Lasfire cut through the darkness at shadows that dissolved before contact. Vox units screamed static that tasted like bile in the mouth. And when dawn broke, 4 men were missing, their posts empty, their footprints ending as though they had walked into the air itself. The first whisper had grown louder. It was no longer confined to the edges of perception, no longer content with subtle dread. It had drawn its mark across their lives with blood, fire, and silence. And in every soul that remained, whether soldier, priest, or simple farmer, a question rooted itself like a thorn that could not be pulled free. How long before the whisper became a voice? By the 9th night, the settlement no longer resembled the quiet outpost it once had been. The streets that usually echoed with the sounds of carts and the hum of the manufactorum were eerily silent, broken only by the crunch of boots over shattered glass and the distant bark of lasfire cutting at phantoms. Families rarely ventured outside, and when they did, their eyes darted from shadow to shadow as if the air itself could betray them. Doors bore fresh scratches as though animals had clawed at them during the night, but no tracks were ever found, no beasts captured. The Astra Militarum patrols carried on their duties, but their steps lacked confidence. The laughter that once filled their mess was gone. Men spoke in whispers, even when sober, glancing constantly at the vox grills as though afraid the machines were listening. A few had begun to carve small wards into their armor. Symbols passed between them in secret, crude etchings that looked like shields or burning suns. They swore it kept the whispers at bay. The commissar caught one man carving such a sigil onto the butt of his last gun, and had him executed in the square at dawn, but the others only looked away. For each who died, the rest grew less certain that the emperor was watching. Father Halric stood at the pulpit that morning with fewer than 10 parishioners. His voice was hoarse, his face drawn, yet he spoke with the fever of one trying to convince himself as much as his flock. He declared the emperor's light eternal, unbroken by shadow, but even as he said the words, a tremor shook the chapel. Dust fell from the rafters, candles extinguished in unison, and for a fleeting moment the statue of the emperor seemed to ripple like liquid stone. The priest froze. He could not move, not even to cross himself. His congregation fled, leaving him alone in the dark, still staring at the unblinking eyes of the figure he had prayed to all his life. Jaren, meanwhile, could no longer distinguish where his notes ended and the voices began. His data slate pulsed faintly, its light dim and throbbing like a heartbeat. Words he had never written appeared between his lines, weaving themselves into sentences that looked almost like prophecy. He read of blood in the rivers, of stars extinguished one by one, of an endless march toward a devouring maw, and though he wanted to throw the slate into the fire, some deeper compulsion forced him to keep writing. He knew with the certainty of doom that the whispers were not merely echoing in the air but crawling into his hand as it moved. It was the disappearance of the northern farmstead that finally shattered the illusion of control. At dawn, a patrol sent to check the crops found the land desolate. The farmhouse stood with its door ajar, but inside every table was overturned, every plate shattered. Beds were empty yet still warm as if their occupants had only just risen. A pot simmered on the hearth, stew bubbling unattended, but no human trace remained. 43 souls gone without struggle, without blood, without a single footprint leading away. Only the fields remained, rows of wheat swaying without wind as though breathing. The commissar ordered the entire farmstead burned. Flames rose against the gray sky, consuming wood, stone, and soil alike, but even in the blaze the wheat did not blacken. It bent slowly, almost reverently, until the fire guttered out around it. Those who witnessed it spoke little after, though some were later found in their bunks muttering prayers backwards, their lips cracked and bleeding. By the end of that day, the outpost had become a husk. Men walked its streets with the blank expressions of sleepwalkers, and even the most hardened officers admitted in hushed tones that something beyond their orders was unfolding. They had not seen an enemy's face, not raised their bayonets in combat, yet the losses mounted not in blood spilled but in faith eroded, in minds frayed. The warp had not yet revealed itself in its full horror, but it did not need to. Its victory lay in silence, in whispers that gnawed at courage, in absence where presence should be. And so on that forsaken world beneath the Emperor's gaze the curse deepened. It was no longer the question of what lay beyond the veil, but of how long the veil itself would endure before it tore entirely. The days that followed were marked not only by fear but by the slow unraveling of faith itself. On a world such as Veora, faith was more than devotion, it was the rhythm of life. Farmers began their work with prayers to the Emperor for fertile soil. Soldiers saluted the Aquila before loading their weapons. Children traced holy signs before sleep. These small rituals once felt like anchors binding fragile mortal lives to the vast immensity of the Imperium. But now each act of faith seemed brittle, as though the very air mocked it. Prayers went unanswered, hymns dissolved into silence, and relics long held sacred felt suddenly powerless. The faithful, still kneeling, began to wonder if they knelt before nothing at all. Father Halric felt the collapse more than anyone. His chapel had stood as a refuge during wars, a place where soldiers confessed sins and peasants found comfort. Now it echoed hollow, the pews half empty, the altar cold. He raised his voice louder with each service, not to inspire his congregation but to silence the gnawing doubt in his own heart. Yet every word carried a weight it had not before. Once his prayers seemed to flow upward, as if carried by unseen wings. Now they fell flat, sinking like stones into water. His hands shook as he lifted the aquila, for in his eyes it no longer gleamed with divine light, but with the dull sheen of lifeless metal. Among the soldiers, faith fractured in different ways. Some clung tighter than ever, shouting litanies during patrols, marking the aquila into the dirt with the butts of their lasguns, daring the shadows to come closer. Others turned inward, silent and sullen, their lips never moving in prayer again. A few began to mutter strange hymns of their own invention, twisting the emperor's words into something unrecognizable. When questioned, they claimed they were guided by dreams more vivid than waking life, dreams where the emperor's face was hidden in shadow and only by changing the words could they reach him. The commissar executed 2 such men, but whispers of these altered hymns continued, growing like mold in the cracks of discipline. Jaren, ever the recorder, began to notice a strange pattern. Where once the people's fear had been random and scattered, it now aligned around faith itself. Those who doubted most deeply suffered the worst visions, and those who clung hardest to their devotion seemed haunted in new ways, as though the warp played with both extremes. He wrote in his journal, "The curse does not silence faith. It feeds upon it, twisting prayer into chain, hymn into mockery. The faithful burn, the faithless wither, and both paths lead to the same ruin." He did not share these words aloud, for to speak them would have been heresy, yet he could not deny what he saw. The turning point came during the Festival of Remembrance, a local rite meant to honor those who had died in service to the Imperium. The entire settlement gathered, as they always had, to place offerings at the chapel's steps, small carvings, scraps of parchment, flowers grown in hard soil. Father Halric stood before them, raising his arms to deliver the ancient prayer. But when he spoke, his voice cracked, and what left his lips was not the emperor's name. The crowd gasped as strange syllables poured forth, guttural and wrong, words that stank of iron and rot. His eyes widened in horror, but he could not stop. It was as though his tongue had been seized, forced to chant a hymn to something he had never believed in. When at last he collapsed, gasping on the chapel floor, silence gripped the crowd. Then panic. Some fled, screaming that the priest himself was cursed. Others rushed forward to help, only to recoil as the offerings at the steps withered before their eyes, flowers crumbling into dust, wood blackening, parchment curling in sudden fire. What should have been a day of unity became a shattering of trust. The people no longer saw their priest as a guide but as a vessel already claimed by something beyond. And in their terror, they turned not to faith but to suspicion, whispering of betrayal, of heresy, of curses passed from man to man like disease. The warp had struck its cruelest blow, not with claws, not with fire, but with doubt. And in the heart of the settlement, that doubt grew heavier than any chain, pressing down on every soul until even the strongest knees began to bend. The aftermath of the festival left Veyora in a state worse than fear division. Where once the people clung together against the curse, now they looked upon one another with suspicion. The farmer who once shared bread with his neighbor now locked his doors at night. The soldier who once marched with his comrade now searched his eyes for hidden corruption. Faith, once their strongest bond, had become the very wedge that drove them apart. Rumors spread with the speed of plague. Some claimed Father Halric had been possessed, his soul long since sold to daemons. Others whispered he was innocent, merely a victim, and that his collapse was a sign the emperor had abandoned them all. A few went further still, declaring that perhaps the curse was no curse at all but a gift, an awakening of truths long hidden. These voices were quiet at first, but in the silence of failed prayers they carried farther than anyone expected. The Commissar Varric acted swiftly. He stood in the square, his voice sharp as steel, demanding loyalty to the throne. "Doubt is heresy," he declared, his eyes burning beneath the brim of his cap. "And heresy feeds the curse." To prove his resolve, he had 3 men executed that very night. 2 for whispering of gifts, 1 for refusing to recite the litany of protection. The shots rang out like thunder, echoing across the settlement. But instead of restoring order, they deepened the fracture. Families wept not only for the dead, but for the cruelty of the living. Where once they had looked to the Commissar for protection, now they saw him as both shield and blade. Father Halric, pale and weakened, withdrew to his chapel. He fasted, prayed, and wept, yet his prayers fell only upon his own ears. His hands trembled when he touched the Aquila, fearing that the next time he opened his mouth those guttural words would return. Jaren visited him often, quill scratching in his journal as the priest spoke in broken whispers. "It is as though my voice is not my own," Halric confessed one evening, his eyes hollow. "When I tried to speak the Emperor's name, it twisted in my throat. I felt watched, not by him, but by something older, darker. It was as though the air itself leaned close, eager to drink the sound." Jaren wrote the words down carefully, but inside he felt the cold spread further. His records were no longer chronicles of history. They had become evidence of the Imperium's silence. As days turned to weeks, signs of deeper corruption surfaced. A squad of soldiers reported finding one of their own kneeling before a wall, carving strange sigils with his fingernails until they bled. He claimed he could hear whispers guiding him, promising relief from the curse if only he marked the symbols in enough places. When the Commissar executed him on the spot, the marks remained etched into the stone, faintly glowing until dawn broke. Elsewhere, a child was born still, her skin mottled and gray, her eyes open though no breath ever filled her lungs. The mother screamed she had felt the Emperor's light vanish from her womb, leaving only shadow. Others whispered it was no child at all but a vessel, an omen of what the curse truly intended. The corpse was buried under rocks outside the settlement, but each morning the pile shifted, as though something within sought to rise. The people's faith shattered further still. Some stopped attending the chapel altogether, others built small shrines in secret corners to voices they did not name aloud. Jaren noticed scraps of parchment, etched with symbols not of the ecclesiarchy, hidden beneath door frames or tied around wrists. They were not prayers to the Emperor, they were something else. By now, even the soldiers could not keep order. Patrols returned sullen, arguing amongst themselves. A fight broke out between 2 squads, one accusing the other of harboring heretics, the other swearing loyalty but unable to prove it. Blood spilled not by daemons but by the Emperor's own. Through it all, the curse deepened its hold. Nights were no longer quiet but alive with whispers. In the darkness of their homes, people heard voices calling their names, sometimes the voices of loved ones, sometimes their own voice repeated back at them. Doors rattled though no wind blew, candles sputtered though no breath touched them. Some claimed to see figures standing in their doorways, gone when they blinked, their eyes burning like coals in the night. Then came the first public renunciation. A soldier named Rin, once known for leading hymns with a booming voice, stepped into the square at dawn. Before the gathered townsfolk, he tore the Aquila from his chest and cast it into the dirt. "The Emperor is dead to us," he cried, his voice hoarse. "Our prayers rot in our mouths, our faith is nothing but chains. I have heard a voice greater than his silence, and it promises not abandonment but power." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some spat at him, others shrank back, but a few, just a few, nodded as though they too had heard such promises. Commissar Varric drew his bolt pistol without hesitation and fired. Rin's skull burst like glass, his body crumpling to the ground. The crowd screamed, some in horror, some in rage, some in eerie silence. But as the smoke cleared, Jaren noticed something dreadful. The Aquila Rin had cast into the dirt was gone. Only the curse did not relent. It tightened, link by link, until life on Veora became a chain dragging every soul downward. Hunger gnawed at the people, for crops withered in their fields and cattle wasted to bone. The wells grew sour, their waters tinged with a bitter taste that left mouths dry no matter how much they drank. Each day became a trial of endurance, not against invaders or storms, but against the invisible noose of despair tightening around the colony. To survive, the townsfolk began rationing with cruelty. Bread was no longer shared, but measured in crumbs. Soldiers patrolled the storehouses, their lasguns not pointed at daemons but at starving peasants. Fistfights broke out in the streets, sparked by scraps of food or a rumor that someone had hoarded grain. The commissar's men enforced order with violence, yet their own bellies growled as loudly as the rest. Hunger made hypocrites of all. Jaren recorded the descent in his journal, his words heavy with exhaustion. The curse is not content to break our faith. It breaks our bodies, forcing us to fight over crumbs like vermin. Where once we prayed, now we barter. Where once we trusted, now we steal. The Emperor's light does not fade, it is smothered by the shadows we cast upon one another. The chains of desperation were not only physical but spiritual. Dreams worsened. Where once the people heard whispers, now they saw visions, chains wrapping their limbs, binding their throats, dragging them into caverns of black fire. In these dreams some struggled, some prayed, but others yielded and awoke stronger, sharper, filled with a grim resolve. They called it endurance. Jaren feared it was corruption. One such soul was Mira, a young woman who had lost her husband to the commissar's bullets weeks before. Once meek, she now strode through the settlement with a fire in her eyes. She spoke not of hunger or fear but of survival at any cost. The Emperor has abandoned us, she told those who would listen, but the curse shows us truth. We suffer because we cling to chains we forged ourselves. Break them, and we are free. Her words spread like sparks among the desperate. To the starving, freedom meant bread. To the grieving, freedom meant vengeance. To the faithful, her words were poison. Father Harrick, still frail but clinging to duty, tried to confront her. But when he raised his trembling voice against her, the crowd did not listen. For the first time in his life, the priest's authority carried no weight. Mira's voice, sharp and unbroken, drowned his out. The commissar moved swiftly, arresting Mira and dragging her before the people as an example. Bound in chains, she stood in the square, defiant. Varric proclaimed her a heretic, her tongue a weapon of the warp, her soul already lost. He raised his pistol, but before he could fire, Mira laughed. "You think these chains bind me?" she cried. "They bind you, every one of you, shackled to a god who does not hear. I have seen the truth in dreams. The curse is not our enemy, it is our deliverance. Kill me, and you will hear the same whispers you pretend not to." The commissar shot her through the chest and she fell, but even in death her smile remained. The crowd dispersed in silence, their eyes avoiding Varric's, but Jaren noticed how some lingered, staring not at the commissar but at Mira's body, as though her words had planted roots deeper than death. That night the chains appeared in more than dreams. Several townsfolk awoke screaming, their limbs bruised as though bound tightly by ropes, though none had touched them. One man was found strangled in his bed, purple marks circling his throat as if iron links had crushed the life from him. His widow swore she heard the sound of clinking chains in the dark, though when soldiers searched they found nothing. The curse had shifted. No longer content with whispers, it now left marks on flesh. Father Harrick, horrified, begged the commissar to cease his executions. "You cannot kill belief with bullets," he pleaded. "Each death feeds the curse more than it starves it." But Varric, his face hollow with sleeplessness, refused. "Mercy is weakness," he said. "Only strength can hold this colony together." Yet even Varric began to falter. Jaren observed him pacing at night, speaking to himself in broken whispers, clutching at his bolt pistol as though it alone kept him sane. The commissar, who had once embodied iron discipline, now trembled like any other man. Chains, Jaren thought, wrapped him too. And in the silence of the chapel, Father Harrick prayed, not for deliverance but for clarity. Yet he feared the answer would not come from the Emperor. The settlement no longer resembled the place it had once been, where songs and hymns had filled the air. Now only the sound of grinding stomachs and muttered curses remained. Every corner of Vayora seemed to echo with the rattle of chains, though none could say where the sound came from. Some claimed it was in the wind, others swore it came from beneath the ground, yet most feared it came from within themselves. The markets collapsed first. Once farmers laid out baskets of grain and root vegetables, exchanging food for coin under the open banners of the Imperium. Now the stalls were empty, their awnings torn, their counters overturned. Trade became whispers in the dark, exchanges of crusts and scraps guarded more fiercely than treasures. Those who hoarded, even a crust too many, risked knives in the night. Hunger did not kill swiftly, it hollowed people from within, reducing them to shadows that clung to their scraps of existence like carrion to a corpse. Children fared worst. Their cries filled the nights, gnawing more deeply at their parents' souls than the pangs of hunger in their bellies. Some mothers wailed in the chapel until their throats bled, begging the emperor for mercy. Others fell into silence, their eyes vacant, as if their spirits had fled to escape what their bodies still endured. And when a child died, the mourning was brief. Grief gave way to grim practicality. The body was buried quickly, sometimes without rites, as though the very act of mourning risked inviting the curse to claim another. Desperation birthed cruelty. Soldiers, once guardians, became predators in their own right. Patrols raided homes, seizing food under the guise of rationing, yet too often their pockets bulged afterward. Jaren recorded one such raid in his journal. His hand shaking, they entered the home of an old widow, accusing her of hiding grain. They found nothing. Yet when they left, I saw one soldier chewing. He had stolen from her directly. She begged them for mercy, but the commissar did not intervene. Her cries followed us into the night, and no prayer silenced them. Amid this decay, whispers of Mira's words persisted. Those who once would have spat at heresy now found themselves tempted. They dreamt of chains, but also of freedom. Freedom not through prayer but through surrender to the voices that promised relief. In hushed corners, groups gathered to repeat her words, to speak of breaking shackles, to wonder aloud if the curse was not punishment but revelation. Father Halric fought to extinguish this heresy, though his own voice faltered. He stood before dwindling congregations, preaching that suffering was a test of devotion, that endurance would prove their loyalty. But even as he spoke, his eyes darted nervously to the rafters, as though he too heard the rattle of unseen chains. The faithful clung to him still, but their numbers shrank, while the heretics swelled. The first riot came without warning. A storehouse was broken into under cover of night, its guards overwhelmed by a mob of starving townsfolk. By dawn the storehouse lay empty, its doors torn from their hinges. The commissar ordered retribution. 10 men executed at random from the rioters, but the punishment did not restore order. It ignited fury. Families of the executed spat on his name, soldiers wavered, and the mob grew bolder. That evening Jaren witnessed something he could not deny. The rioters who had stolen from the storehouse walked through the streets with unnatural vigor, their cheeks no longer gaunt, their eyes alight with feverish strength. They spoke of a feast not of bread or meat, but of promises whispered to them in the night. "The chains break for us," they said, smiling with cracked lips. "We are fed by more than food." The curse had found new worshippers, and in their desperation, the colony began to split, not merely between the starving and the fed, but between those who clung to the emperor and those who embraced the whispers. Night fell over Vayora like a burial shroud, heavy and suffocating. The stars above seemed dimmer, their light strained through a veil of unseen chains. Lanterns flickered in the streets, but their glow was feeble, swallowed by the gloom pressing against the walls of every home. In the silence the people heard it again, the steady clink of links tightening, drawing them down into the abyss together. Father Halric could no longer sleep. He staggered through the chapel halls, clutching his aquila, whispering litanies with lips cracked and bleeding. He prayed not for strength but for silence, for a reprieve from the endless chorus of rattle and whisper that haunted every breath. Yet prayer brought no relief. Once the emperor's light had been a steady beacon in his heart. Now it flickered, faint and trembling, like a candle guttering in the wind. The commissar grew harsher still. Varric's eyes were sunken, his hand always near his pistol. He barked orders with the hollow ferocity of a man at war with shadows. When another food riot flared in the southern quarter, he ordered his soldiers to fire indiscriminately. Dozens fell, blood staining the dust. The screams carried through the streets, but the mob did not scatter as he had intended. Instead, they howled his name in defiance. They had stopped fearing him. To them he was just another chain to be broken. Jeren, watching from the edges, felt the colony slipping beyond reason. The heretics gathered openly now, no longer in hidden corners. They painted symbols on walls, marks that twisted the eyes and made the air thick around them. They spoke of Mira as a prophet, her death as the first link shattered, her laughter echoing still in their dreams. She showed us the way, they chanted, and the chains cannot bind us. Then came the first disappearance. A child was taken from her home in the night, her bed left empty, her mother's wails piercing the stillness until dawn. The guards searched but found nothing, only a trail of scuffed dirt leading into the chapel itself. Inside, near the altar, they discovered marks in the stone floor, as though iron chains had scraped across it. The message was unmistakable. The curse no longer lingered in shadows. It walked openly among them, dragging its links across consecrated ground. Father Halric wept upon the altar, his tears falling on the cold stone, his prayers breaking into ragged sobs. "We are losing them," he whispered. "We are losing them all." Jeren's hand trembled as he wrote by candlelight, the ink blurring across the page. "We have crossed a threshold. Hunger and cruelty bound us, but now something greater feeds upon us. The curse has become flesh in spirit, a chain that drags us where it wills. I fear the breaking point is near, and when it comes, Vayora will not survive." The chains rattled once more, louder than ever before, and every soul in the colony felt it, like a sentence being pronounced. The morning after the chains rang loudest, Vayora awoke changed. The air itself felt heavy, pressing down upon lungs with every breath. Ash drifted where no fire burned, coating rooftops and clinging to the skin like a second layer of decay. Some swore the ash fell from the sky, but others whispered it rose from the earth itself, a sign that the ground beneath their feet was no longer theirs. The colony's streets carried an uneasy silence, broken not by the hum of labor or chatter of neighbors, but by the hollow scrape of bare feet. Processions of heretics began to march openly, their eyes wild, their mouths chanting in unison words that made the faithful clutch their ears. They carried chains in their hands, rattling them as they walked, proclaiming themselves already unbound. Their children followed, dragging smaller links behind them, laughing as though it were a game. The commissar tried to scatter them, sending squads of soldiers into the streets, but the heretics did not run. They knelt together in the dust, chains clutched to their breasts, and whispered in tongues the soldiers did not understand. Some of the soldiers faltered, their grips tightening on lasguns, their eyes flicking nervously to the commissar. When the order came, they fired into kneeling figures. The chains clattered as bodies fell, yet before the echoes of the volleys had faded, new processions rose in other streets, chanting louder still. Jaren wrote, "The curse has found its choir. For every heretic who falls, another rises to sing. They do not fear bullets, they welcome them. We kill their flesh, but their whispers grow, and I fear even the soldiers begin to listen." Within the chapel, Father Halric gathered the remnants of the faithful. Their faces were gaunt, their voices hoarse, but they clung to prayer with a desperation that mirrored the heretic's zeal. He lifted the aquila above his head, its gilded wings glimmering faintly in the candlelight, and begged his congregation to endure. "The Emperor does not abandon," he said, his voice trembling but determined. "He tests. Chains of suffering are broken, not by surrender, but by faith." But even as he spoke, the sound of chains scraped across the chapel walls, though none were there. The candles flickered and dimmed, shadows crawling upward like vines. The faithful bowed their heads, muttering louder prayers, yet some glanced toward the doors, their eyes filled with the temptation of escape. The curse had reached beyond hunger and cruelty. It had become an echo that reshaped the world itself, bending stone, shadow, and air to its rhythm. At night, the colony was haunted not just by whispers, but by shapes glimpsed in torchlight, figures made of links, towering and formless, sliding along walls and vanishing when confronted. No weapon touched them, no prayer dispelled them. They watched, and they waited. The commissar's iron resolve began to crack. He called a council of what leaders remained, Father Harrick Jaron, and a handful of captains. His eyes were bloodshot, his uniform disheveled, as though sleep had abandoned him entirely. "We hold," he growled, his voice raw. "We hold until relief comes from the Astra Militarum. Terra has not forgotten us." Harrick lowered his gaze. "Relief requires the Astronomican's light to guide them here. But I fear even the stars cannot pierce this shadow." Silence fell over the council. Each man present knew the truth, but dared not speak it. No relief was coming. The Imperium was vast, and Viora was but a speck. In the scale of eternity, their suffering was less than a whisper. Outside, the chanting of heretics grew louder. Chains clattered like war drums. The colony no longer waited for salvation, it waited for collapse. In the second week, the heretics no longer hid their gatherings. They filled the central square where markets once bustled, erecting crude shrines from shattered furniture and twisted iron draped with chains scavenged from workshops and manufactoria. Fires burned in oil drums, their smoke carrying a stench not of wood or promethium, but of something fouler, acrid and sweet at once, clinging to the tongue long after the air was swallowed. Jaron forced himself to watch, his quill scratching even as bile rose in his throat. The heretics sang, not hymns of the ecclesiarchy, but verses stitched together from Mira's last words, warped and repeated, until their rhythm became a dirge. Children danced around the flames, their eyes vacant, their voices shrill as they cried out for freedom from the Emperor's chains. The adults raised their arms, bruised wrists bound in iron links they wore as blessings rather than shackles. When Father Halric attempted to intervene, carrying the Aquila high and reciting the Catechism of Endurance, the mob drowned him out with laughter. Some jeered, others spat, and a handful hurled stones. The Aquila struck the dirt, its wings bent. Halric staggered, blood tracing a line down his temple, and was dragged away by the faithful before worse befell him. Jaron wrote, "The sight of the Aquila fallen cut deeper than stone. It was not metal they struck down, it was hope itself." The commissar responded with rage. He gathered the last of his disciplined men, and stormed the square with bayonets fixed. Lasfire lit the night, shrieks rose like a tide, and smoke choked the streets as bodies fell. Chains rattled beneath boots as soldiers crushed shrines underfoot, scattering iron links into the dirt. For a moment, order seemed restored, but dawn revealed the truth. Where blood had soaked the cobblestones, new symbols had formed overnight. Twisting, jagged shapes writhed across the stones, not painted but seared into the very rock as though by fire. Those who gazed upon them too long felt their stomachs turn and their ears ring with phantom rattling. Some vomited, a few laughed hysterically until they collapsed, and when the commissar ordered the symbols destroyed, the stone resisted picks and hammers alike. Jaron wrote, "The curse does not sleep, it does not break when men fall. It thrives on blood, grows stronger when we strike at it. Each act of violence feeds it, as if the colony itself were becoming its altar." The soldiers who fought in the square began to change. Their eyes grew sunken, their movements sluggish, as if unseen weights pulled at their limbs. Some awoke screaming in their bunks, bruises circling their wrists and ankles, though no chains bound them. A few deserted entirely, vanishing into the night. By morning their armor and weapons were found in the square, placed neatly among the shrines as offerings. Father Halric's sermons grew desperate. His voice cracked as he implored the faithful not to waver, even as their numbers dwindled. "We must not feed the echo," he whispered, his hands trembling over the Aquila he had repaired with binding wire. But even he knew his words fell like rain upon barren soil. Each day more pews sat empty. Each night, the chanting outside swelled louder. In the margins of his journal, Jaron confessed his darkest thought. Perhaps Mira was right. Perhaps the Emperor does not hear us here. For if he did, why would the curse grow stronger while our prayers fade into silence? The colony teetered on a precipice. Faith fractured, discipline crumbled, and the curse's echoes no longer lingered at the edge of perception. They wove themselves into stone, into soldiers, into dreams. The square became a second heart for Viora, beating in rhythm with the chains, and from that heart, the curse spread outward, like a sickness with no cure. The echoes never truly faded. They lingered across the ruins, drifting like phantoms that clung to shattered stone and rusted steel. In the hushed corridors of derelict manufactoria, the whispers grew louder, as though the walls themselves carried memory. Some swore they could hear the laughter of daemons masked beneath the grinding of metal plates. Others claimed it was only the wind howling through broken windows, but none could silence the certainty that the city was listening. And in that listening, it judged. The faithful knelt longer at their shrines, bleeding knuckles against cold stone, whispering the same prayer into the dust 1,000 times over, while the faithless drank deep from whatever poison they could find, pretending deafness until their hearts finally stilled. Both responses were hollow, for neither faith nor denial drowned out the truth that the ruin itself had become alive in its silence. The Astra Militarum patrols who ventured too far into the labyrinth rarely returned unchanged. Some staggered back wide-eyed and trembling, weapons clutched so tightly that blood pooled in their palms. Others never returned at all, only their gear discovered later, placed neatly in impossible positions, as if set deliberately by unseen hands. To those who survived, the message was clear. The city's bones did not belong to them. It belonged to the echoes, to the lingering stain of a war that had not ended, but merely paused, waiting for its next chorus. Servitors roamed the desolation as well, their vox grills hissing with corrupted hymns no one remembered programming into their circuits. The Mechanicus called it interference, the common folk called it a curse, but the sound carved fear into the marrow of all who heard it. An echo of ruin, stripped of logic and swollen with dread, and so the survivors moved differently now. Steps softened, breath measured, words hushed, for they knew that even speaking aloud risked feeding the resonance that crept along the ruins like a shadow. Yet in that silence, a dangerous question emerged. If ruins remembered, if steel and stone could hold echoes of suffering, then what did that mean for the galaxy itself? Every battlefield was an ossuary, every world a graveyard. Was reality itself bending beneath the weight of so many unburied screams? The ecclesiarchy would have called such thoughts heresy, yet heresy or not, the idea persisted, like a seed that no sermon could uproot. And it was here, in this fragile space between memory and madness, that whispers of something greater stirred, not just ruins that listened but echoes that reached further, across stars into the very fabric of the warp. There were tales of a commander who dreamt voices that were not his own, who awoke with coordinates burned into his mind, of an entire regiment that marched into the mists, chasing a phantom hymn, never to be seen again, of civilians who spoke in tongues older than any archive, their eyes white with visions of things that should not be named. These were not isolated incidents, they were spreading, and like cracks in a dam, they heralded something vast and inevitable. The ruins were no longer just ruins. They were conduits, memories feeding into memories, pain feeding into pain, until the boundary between past and present fractured. Those who felt it swore the galaxy itself was beginning to echo, the ruin of one world was becoming the ruin of all, and so Chapter 5 closed not with silence, but with resonance. A deep, haunting undertone that reached far beyond the dead city, a warning disguised as a song, a dirge carried by dust and void alike. The Imperium could ignore it for a time, could drown it in sermons and artillery fire, but echoes have patience, and in patience they grow louder. Destiny in the Imperium was never written in stars but carved in scars. Every scar across a soldier's flesh, every fracture in the stone of a fortress, every lost shrine or shattered relic, spoke of a fate heavier than worlds could bear. Yet among the endless void, there lingered tales darker than wounds and deeper than ruin, tales of those who defied the warp and found themselves shackled to a destiny that was neither chosen nor merciful. The cursed ones, marked by powers they could never escape, became living testaments that the warp does not grant gifts, only chains. Among the faithful, whispers told of commanders who stared too long into the fire of battle and returned with voices in their skulls, speaking words in tongues they had never learned. Priests claimed such voices were the Emperor's light guiding his children, but soldiers knew better. The light of the Emperor was steady, a flame that did not flicker. These voices bent and twisted like smoke, promising salvation one moment and screaming damnation the next. Those marked by such voices seldom survived long. Some vanished into the warp, bodies collapsing into thin air. Others endured, their eyes hollow yet burning with something alien, as though they had glimpsed eternity and found it empty. To be cursed was not always to be monstrous. Some bore no mutations, no horns or claws tearing from their skin, no scales shimmering in the light of forbidden suns. Their curse was subtler, crueler. They dreamed in patterns, visions of battles yet to come, deaths they could not prevent, entire regiments swallowed whole by fates they saw but could not change. And when those visions came true, as they always did, no one looked at them as prophets. They looked at them as harbingers. A cursed destiny in the Imperium was not a warning, it was a death sentence written before the first shot was fired. The ecclesiarchy held sermons declaring that the curse had existed only to test the faith of others. To shun them was to strengthen the soul, to burn them was to purify the world. But in the shadowed corners of hive cities, where sermons rarely reached, and the stench of promethium filled every lung, the cursed was something else entirely. They were feared not because of heresy, but because they reminded the living that the warp always found a way in. You could build walls of adamantium, raise fleets of void ships, train legions of warriors, yet still the warp would seep through, carving destiny into flesh like a scar that could never be healed. There are records in the Libreria Obscura of the cursed fighting alongside the Imperium, bearing their fate like a chain they refused to drop. One fragment speaks of a sister of battle who survived an encounter with a daemon prince, her body unbroken but her shadow forever warped. They said flames clung to her even when unlit candles surrounded her, that her hymns bled through walls like echoes in the bone. She never turned her faith away, never knelt before the gods of chaos, yet still she was marked. In battle, her voice would crack vox grills, and her prayers carried a weight that silenced even Astartes. To some she was a miracle, to others she was a warning of how close sainthood and damnation truly lay. And that was the nature of cursed destinies in Warhammer 40K. They were never clean, never absolute. They were contradictions made flesh, men and women trapped between duty and doom, between the Emperor's silence and the warp's whispers. Those who bore such marks were hunted, feared, and often destroyed, yet their stories never vanished. They became legends, myths whispered in barracks, tales told in manufactoria, between the shriek of gears, parables painted in the margins of illuminated manuscripts. The cursed never ruled, but they endured, and endurance itself was a curse, for to endure in the galaxy of the 41st millennium was to walk forever in shadow. The cursed walked unnoticed among the ranks of the Imperium until their shadow grew too heavy to hide. A guardsman could fight beside his comrades for years before one night he woke screaming, his veins glowing faintly with a light no lumen could cast. His brothers would bind him, pray over him, and deliver him to the nearest confessor, yet no sermon could strip away what had been etched upon his soul. The curse lingered, feeding, waiting. Some commanders chose mercy in the form of a last bolt to the skull. Others, clinging to the Emperor's judgment, dragged the cursed in chains across half a sector just to see them burn on the steps of a cathedral. Both fates ended the same in silence, with only the void remembering their screams. For some, however, destiny did not allow so simple an ending. There are fragments in inquisitorial vaults, sealed testimonies no scribe dares read aloud, that speak of cursed men and women pressed into service as living weapons. Their bodies were harnessed with machinery, their minds shackled with psychic wards. The Mechanicus called them salvaged assets, while the Inquisition named them contingency measures. They were unleashed only when the tide of battle seemed beyond salvation. Some exploded in wild psychic storms, reducing daemon hordes and imperial regiments alike to dust. Others vanished, torn into the immaterium, leaving behind nothing but a smell of ash and the faint echo of their last words. To use such souls was a gamble, but in the dark millennium, gambles were all that remained. What made their fate unbearable was not always their destruction but the waiting. Imagine knowing your life was measured, not in years, not in victories, but in moments until the curse claimed you. A sister who prayed each dawn might feel her tongue twist mid-hymn, syllables bending into sounds no mortal choir had ever sung. A Scatarius, once precise and flawless in execution, could falter as corrupted data whispered through his augmetics, warping code into prophecy. Even a custodian, shield of the emperor himself, was not immune, though none would admit it openly. There were hushed reports of one such golden warrior seen muttering to shadows, his auramite armor trembling as if resonating with whispers no ear could catch. If true, then even the most perfect of the emperor's chosen could not outrun a cursed destiny. Yet the galaxy did not weep for them. The Imperium had no mercy to spare. Billions died nameless each day beneath the banners of terror, and to be cursed was simply to die with a different story. But those stories mattered. They lingered like echoes, retold again and again, reshaped into warnings, prayers, or nightmares. In a manufactorum deep within the rusting heart of Necromunda, workers still murmur about a child who foresaw an entire dome collapsing hours before it fell. She begged the overseers to evacuate, but they laughed, calling her mad. When the collapse came, thousands perished, and those who survived swore they could hear her voice beneath the rubble, still crying, still warning, long after her body had turned to dust. The cursed destiny was not simply a mark of doom. It was a mirror held against the Imperium itself. It showed a truth most dared not speak aloud, that humanity was never safe from the warp, not even in its faith, not even in its strength. Every cursed soul reminded the galaxy that the line between loyalty and heresy was a thread thinner than a hair, and that the warp could twist even devotion into a weapon. It was not only chaos cults and traitors who damned mankind. Sometimes it was the faithful themselves, burned from the inside out by destinies they could not refuse. In the sermons of the ecclesiarchy, cursed souls were framed as necessary sacrifices. Their agony kept the Imperium vigilant. Their downfall reminded the faithful to kneel longer, to pray harder, to scourge their flesh until the Emperor's light burned brighter than whispers. But in hushed corners some claimed the cursed were chosen not by chaos but by the Emperor himself, that their suffering was a burden placed upon them so that others could walk unbroken. A dangerous thought, whispered too softly to survive, for to say it aloud would be heresy, and heresy was a death more final than the curse itself. The greatest cruelty of a cursed destiny was not in how it ended, but in how it lingered. Death, in the galaxy of the 41st millennium, was a mercy granted swiftly by bolter, blade, or void. But the cursed did not pass so easily. They carried their burden like an iron crown, each moment alive stretched taut with dread of what the warp would claim next. To walk the line between damnation and devotion was to be stripped of comfort, left only with the knowledge that every prayer, every breath, every step might be the one that dragged them across the threshold forever. Among the cursed there were some who tried to defy their fate outright. Whole lives were spent in denial, clinging to faith like a lifeline as their voices shook with hymns. Some sought exile, wandering from system to system, taking on false names, hoping that distance might dull the mark carved into their soul. Yet the warp has no borders. The further they ran, the louder it seemed to call, until their end came not as a mercy but as a spectacle. There are tales of a pilgrim who fled from shrine world to shrine world to shrine world, whispering only prayers of light, until on his final day he simply burned. No flame touched him, no torch ignited, and yet his body was consumed in silence, leaving only ash drifting in the cathedral air. Others embraced the curse, seeing in it a weapon sharper than any blade. They marched into battles where no sane soldier would stand, hurling themselves into the jaws of daemons, their cursed presence disrupting the enemy like oil poured into water. Some triumphed, their fate delayed by sheer defiance. More were obliterated, their deaths violent enough to scar the earth itself. Yet even these souls were remembered, not as martyrs nor heroes, but as reminders that destiny in the Imperium was never free of cost. And still, for every name that lingers in whispers, there are countless more who vanish without record. Farmers, scribes, gangers, pilgrims, ordinary lives broken by whispers only they could hear. No archives preserve their end, no statues mark their graves, yet their absence shapes the galaxy as surely as any crusade, for in the silence they leave behind, one truth resounds: the warp does not forget, and it never forgives. So the cursed walk on, neither wholly damned nor wholly saved, but trapped in a fate that no prayer can shatter, and no bullet can redeem. They are the living proof that in Warhammer 40K, destiny is not a gift, nor a choice but a chain, and some chains once forged can never be broken.